Hi everyone. One of the ways we're adjusting to the coronavirus epidemic is by using the internet much more, particularly in our communications and our various interactions. To that end, I've prepared a presentation on David Lubin that I was supposed to present a few days ago at Mosaic Law's KOH Center. I hope you enjoy it, and stay well. David Lubin was a man that most of you are probably unfamiliar with. Those few that do know his name likely recognize it from the famous Weinstock-Lubin department stores that were Northern California landmarks for a great many years, or from the well-known public school in Sacramento named after him. Yet Lubin was an incredibly accomplished and world-renowned individual who was not only responsible for many extraordinary achievements in California, but was also the individual responsible for creating our modern understanding of global cooperation. Yet, if you visit the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, whenever it reopens, you will not see a mention of David Lubin anywhere, not even a small vignette. David Lubin remains a ghost to most Americans. That is why I wrote his biography and why I'm making this presentation. I also wanted to address the general loss of appreciation that the strength, uniqueness, and exceptionalism of America flows from its character as a nation of determined immigrants, and David Lubin, along with so many others, are brilliant examples of this. This slide represents a more contemporary example, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Vixere fortes ante Agamemnona. This is the age-old lament of many titans of human development. Translated from the Latin, it means, many heroes lived before Agamemnon, but they are all unmourned and consigned to oblivion, because they had no bard to sing their praises. Lubin is truly one of those titans, and our unfamiliarity with him is clear evidence of this lament. Lubin's story is an extensive narrative covering an incredible number of accomplishments. I will limit this presentation to his early years, that is, from the time of his birth through to his phenomenal successes in California. In doing so, I'll try to get into the personal motivations that drove him to create these achievements. It should be borne in mind, however, that this presentation really covers only half of his life. The other half was centered in Rome, Italy. This Roman part of his life was devoted to the near impossible task of transcending tribalism, developing a means of resolving differences and disputes amongst countries. He developed an approach based on civilized international debate rather than violent conflict. In a nutshell, he conceived the construct of the United Nations. Of course, there are many that don't believe in the current model of the UN. Obviously, Lubin's idealistic goal still has a way to go before it is fully functional. But bear in mind that, before Lubin, history reveals no approach to international conflict other than armed aggression. I will cover just a bit of this, and if you're interested, I can always make a fuller presentation at a later date on this aspect of his life. Now, was Lubin's incredible record of accomplishment a result of nature or nurture? Could Lubin have been as successful in any country other than America? Or was his ambition and motivation a product of his family's influence? These are key questions to consider in understanding him. So let us begin with a description of the environment into which David Lubin was born. Lubin's family originated in the Pale of Settlement in Greater Russia, an area that was conceived during the first partition of Poland in 1772. It included Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Moldova, Latvia, and much of the Ukraine. The Pale itself became a political reality under the rule of Catherine the Great in 1791, with the intended purpose of confining Russia's Jews, who were deemed pariahs and considered social and religious threats by both the church and the government. At the end of the 19th century, almost 95% of the 5 million Jews living in the Russian Empire, which included Poland, were relegated to the Pale of Settlement. It was a region designed to suppress progress and assimilation. Jews were prevented from traveling outside their villages and were prevented from attending university. Jews could not engage in agriculture or own land. Most worked as unskilled laborers, shopkeepers, artisans, or traders, all of them bound to their local villages or shtetl. Because of the oppressive limitations placed on Jews in the Pale, they turned their intellect inward and focused entirely on their traditional culture. Shtetl dwellers could endlessly analyze and debate the most sophisticated interpretations of the biblical commentaries, but few of them could tell you the name of the town located 30 miles away. The shtetl became their entire universe, and the grim nature of the local economy compelled most to become Luftmenschen. So, what was a Luftmensch? Well, the term had two very different meanings, even though they were rooted in the same word Luft, or air. To Germans, the term was flattering. It referred to those intellectuals who pondered the deeper meanings of life, theories that resided in the celestial ether, in the heavens, the avant-garde philosophers, the intelligentsia. It was the opposite of being materialistic, which to some was not such a bad thing, particularly if they could afford it. For the impoverished Jews in the Pale, however, the word meant something quite different and almost the opposite. The economic paralysis that Russian Jews faced in the Pale never afforded enough income to support a family. So every person had to use their wits to make a few extra zlotys or kopecks by doing something on the side, by making money out of nothing, out of air, Luft. For instance, if someone found out that Yankel the ink maker was having trouble getting rid of the large stock he bought in bulk, they visited Schendel, the matchmaker, and gave her a kopeck or two to find out who in the shtetl might be getting married in the next month or so, because a lot of ink was needed to prepare wedding invitations. Yankel would be happy to part with 5 kopecks for such vital information. If, on the other hand, one heard that Yakov the stockman couldn't afford to feed the heifer he recently bought, they rushed over to Velvel the butcher and told him that they knew of a first-rate deal on a lovely calf, and for 10 kopecks would let the butcher know where this excellent opportunity could be had. Being a Luftmensch meant you had to be on your toes constantly and sharp enough to be able to shape an effective deal quickly. These Luftmenschen were the originators of the art of the deal. Some were so good at it, that's all they did. Others were not so successful and couldn't earn enough out of all their combined labors to support a family. But whether you did well or did poorly, you always placed your faith in God to somehow provide enough to survive. Life in the shtetl was precarious. Most of the time the Jews and their non-Jewish peasant neighbors managed to get along. Because Judaism represented a challenge to the Russian Orthodox Church, clerics openly disrespected and offended Jews. These slights resulted in very little harm because the peasants were too busy toiling the land to trouble their Jewish neighbors. But when the powers that be thought it appropriate for Jews to serve as scapegoats for certain problems, the church would rally their flock to descend upon the Jews in a pogrom. The hard-living, hard-drinking peasants would then go on a drunken rampage, attacking the shtetl's Jews and destroying or stealing the little property they had. Invariably, at the head of these ferocious mobs was always a priest egging them on. Pogroms were a continuous worry in the shtetl, not necessarily because of their frequency, but because of their potential outcomes. The goal of the church and the government was to make sure that Jews never felt secure nor thrived in the Pale, and pogroms were an effective means of ensuring this. The biography of David Lubin is the story of a child born in 1849 who escaped the suffocating poverty and repression of the Russian Pale to make his fortune in America. Pursuing the destiny foretold at his birth, he ultimately applied all his wealth, his heart and soul, to the service of others. For those of us that have given up on the idealistic vision of humans living their lives inspired by the moral principles laid out in the Bible, Lubin's endeavors and commercial successes should give us pause to reconsider this view of human nature as selfish and incorrigible. Perhaps human beings can be noble. On Sunday, June 10, 1849, a child who was destined to become one of modern history's brightest thinkers and achievers was born to the Lubins in the town of Kladowa, Poland. In the mid-19th century, giving birth was an extremely strenuous experience. 4 days after giving birth, Rachel Lubin used her limited strength to nurse her new son, watch over her other children, and keep the family home clean. She cooked the Sabbath meal and was preparing to light the candles at sundown in anticipation of her husband's return from Friday prayers. The older children laid out the table and joined her on the bed while she breastfed her new boy. Rachel held her infant son in one arm and balanced the heavy old candelabra on her knees. She closed her eyes and began to chant the sacred blessings. Her 2 young girls silently copied her. The first candle was lit, and she was using it to kindle the second, when one of the children shifted on the bed and a drop of burning wax dripped onto her son's cheek. He shrieked in pain. In panic, Rachel immediately brushed the hot wax off his cheek, but not before it seared a small scar on his skin that was to mark him for life. Rachel cried aloud in horror. Children followed. Rachel's husband Isaac, her eldest son Simon, and a young traveling rabbi invited for Sabbath returned from synagogue and heard the commotion going on in the house. They rushed into a scene of near pandemonium. Isaac quieted everyone and double-checked to see that there was no further danger of fire in the house. The rabbi looked at the baby and asked Rachel if he might hold the shrieking child. With some reluctance, Rachel, careful not to make personal contact with the rabbi, as custom dictated, handed over the wailing child. The rabbi carefully held the baby and began to rock him back and forth while murmuring prayers for healing. The rabbi quietly asked Rachel who the child would be named after. Rachel responded that the boy would be named after his maternal grandfather Pinchas. The young rabbi opened his eyes wide and proclaimed, "No, no, I fully respect your wish to honor his grandfather, but you must consider what happened here tonight." He raised his voice. "This Sabbath night we received a visit from God. We saw this child receive a sign from heaven, a drop of candle wax, a blessing. The Almighty placed a mark of distinction on this child that will remain forever. This is no ordinary child. He has been chosen by the Almighty. The only name he can be given is David. David, the holy shepherd that God selected to be our king. And like King David, this blessed child will one day be a leader of men and kings." And so it was. Suddenly, the room fell silent. They heard drunken yelling and laughter approaching along the muddy road outside. Was it a few inebriated farm peasants, or was it a gang of drunken thugs getting ready for a local pogrom? Looking through a slit in the shutter, no priest was to be seen anywhere, a sure sign that no one was there to fire up the anti-Semitic passions of the peasants. There would be no pogrom. Everyone quietly exhaled in relief. It was a reminder that the pendulum of Jewish fate was never far away. The Lubins knew that if their children were to be free and prosper, they had to escape the Pale. There was no other option. They wanted to go to America but could not afford to make the full journey in one go. After thinking it over, they decided to travel first to England, learn the English language, and earn enough to carry on to America. I will let you imagine the difficulties a poor kosher family endured, traveling in third-class steerage on a sailing vessel, especially on the turbulent Baltic. The only toilets on board were located on the upper deck, so the steerage passengers had to make do with buckets. Hatches were closed to prevent flooding, and the foul atmosphere, together with the herring and the ship's rocking motion, made everybody in steerage sick. Enough said. Once through the Baltic, the ship entered the even more turbulent North Sea, but before long they turned south past the coast of Scotland, where the seas finally settled, then down through the Dover Narrows, and starboard up the Thames estuary. Finally they came in sight of the great metropolis of London. The family disembarked and were met by the Jewish Aid Society. Upon learning that Rachel's husband was a qualified tailor, the family were immediately taken over by a garment maker's agent who offered meager but acceptable lodging and a job to commence the next day. All of this in Whitechapel, London's famous East End, the main living area of London's Jews. The very same location is the Royal London Hospital and its most famous resident, the Elephant Man, as well as the soon-to-be haunt of the Ripper. Although considered by some as being a seedy neighborhood, London's East End was a thriving community which supported a rich cultural heritage and the famous Bevis Marks Synagogue. All of David's family worked hard at the various occupations available in the garment trade: darning, clobbering, cutting, etc. They learned English and saved as much of their earnings as they could. 3 years after arriving in England, the Lubin family had enough savings to embark on the voyage to their final destination, America. David grew to love the idea of traveling. Towards the end of 1855, the Lubins arrived in New York. They knew the streets weren't paved with gold, but freedom and the chance to survive was worth far more. After disembarking and passing through the Castle Garden Emigrant Landing Station, the Jewish Aid Society helped the family settle into New York's Lower East Side. They were told that the country held great freedom and opportunity. Anti-Semitism still existed, but not to the extent that would prevent them from flourishing. The parents immediately went to work and the children to school. Young David was not a great student, but he was a voracious reader and began combing through the books in the local Maimonides Literary Association library. He developed a very strong attitude against racism and anti-Semitism. On the eve of the Civil War, at the age of 12, David stopped his schooling and traveled up to work in New England, America's industrial hub at the time. He sent all his wages home to his mother in New York City. He quickly discovered an excellent library in the neighboring town and every night immersed himself in self-study of the great philosophers and biblical masters. While in New England, Lubin dreamed of heading out west. He dreamed of the vast plains and the craggy Pacific mountains with their spectacular sunsets. At 17 years of age, he told his mother of his dreams. She encouraged him to go and visit his sister in San Francisco and passed on most of his savings that he had sent her over the years in order to finance his trip. She also took the time to remind him of the little scar on his cheek and his destiny foretold by the rabbi right after his birth. On his trip out west, David stopped off in Chicago to earn additional funding for his voyage. He took a job in a hog slaughterhouse, employment that tormented him because it was the epitome of an unkosher occupation. Just as bad was the cruel handling of the animals before slaughter, and worse, the abusive treatment of the immigrant plant workers. It would be instructive to all here today, watching this presentation, to read Upton Sinclair's 1906 expose of Chicago's meatpacking business, the infamous novel The Jungle. He couldn't wait to leave Chicago, and 3 months later he boarded a train to continue his journey west. He was taken aback when the railroad agent detected a slight foreign accent in his English. Lubin determined to develop a whole new accent, that of the quintessential American, a cowboy drawl. He practiced and practiced. and in time this unmistakable Western brogue defined his daily speech. On his trip through the train window, he loved seeing the wild mustangs galloping across the grasslands, but was mortified to see the remains of buffalo slaughter, and worse, the pitiless treatment of Native Americans. He closed his eyes and reminded himself of his foretold destiny. Could he ever right these wrongs? He disembarked in San Francisco and met his sister Jenny and her husband. They offered him work in their small dry goods store, but he declined and began working as a jeweler. A short time later, he decided to try his hand at gold prospecting. Once, he became separated from his group and was lost in the desert for 3 days with only his canteen. His wandering in the Great Sonora Desert strengthened his belief in the Almighty and furthered the conviction of his life's destiny. Like so many others, he totally failed at gold prospecting. He returned to New York with less than he left with and took a job as an oil lamp salesman. He invented an explosion-proof oil lamp and patented it in June 1872. Lubin did well financially, but his wanderlust drove him to take time off and visit Europe. While traveling in Europe, he received a cable from his sister Jenny. Her husband had just passed away, and his life insurance payout allowed her to invest in a larger dry goods store. She begged David to join her and their younger half-brother Harrison Weinstock to run the store in San Francisco. David thought about it. He thought about his foretold destiny and agreed to return to California. He added $200 of his own money to the dry goods business. In those days, being a merchant in San Francisco was not the most noble profession. The store goods were not priced, and the goal of every sale was to gouge as much as possible from the customer. Haggling was the modus operandi. Salesmen stood at their doorways trying to hook in the sailors, the miners, and the railroad workers who were flush with their recent earnings. David was a very convincing salesperson, but he detested the way the daily business was carried out. One day, he managed to bamboozle a young, gullible sailor out of a great deal of money for a simple pea jacket. Afterwards, he felt so guilty and ashamed, he ran out of the store to chase down the sailor so he could return his money, but couldn't find him. He returned to the shop and thought of his supposed life destiny. Did the Almighty choose him to become nothing more than a swindler? Lubin was mortified and felt deeply ashamed. This was his moment of epiphany. Then and there, Lubin vowed he would never cheat customers or treat people in that way again. Never. After all, he spent so much of his young lifetime studying the moral precepts of the holy books and the great philosophers. From that moment on, everyone would be treated well and equitably, as if they were in his own family. But it was not going to be easy. He had to figure out the best way to accomplish this and at the same time be successful in the retailing business. It was all well and good to be idealistic, but he also had to be practical. David decided that all the prices and descriptions of quality would be openly posted on the goods, so customers could see it before buying. His prices would be low, but firm. No bargaining, no haggling. He was going to work as hard as possible to get the highest quality goods at the lowest possible price, and then pass the savings on to his customers. With those rules in mind, he told his sister and half-brother that he was going up to Sacramento to try his new way of retailing. Taking his share of the goods from the dry goods store, he piled them all in a paddle wheeler and headed up the American River to try his luck in Sacramento. In 1874, Lubin opened his one-price store on the waterfront at K Street in Sacramento. His new approach to retailing became an overnight sensation. The store became so popular it quickly tripled in size. David was forced to bring in his half-brother Harrison Weinstock to help him run the shop. Ego was not one of Lubin's fortes, and as an incentive insisted that Harrison's name precede his own on the storefront. They did so well that within a few years they opened the first large department store west of Chicago, the legendary Weinstock Lubin department store. Overnight, Lubin became a very wealthy man, and David made good on the old promise he had made to his mother, to take her to visit Israel as soon as he could afford it. While in Israel, he visited the Bilu pioneer students who emigrated from Kharkov in Russia. They were using science to restore the agricultural land that was laid waste over the centuries of Ottoman rule. He was touched by their optimism to one day turn the deserts of Rishon LeZion into vineyards, the same place we buy our kosher wine from today. The idea of farming fascinated him, and when he returned to Sacramento, he decided to try his hand at it. He turned over more of the retailing duties to Weinstock. David very, very quickly became one of the most successful fruit and grain farmers in Northern California. His creativity resulted in more than 30 patents for agricultural machines. He was really a brilliant man. Lubin introduced the most far-reaching and benevolent practices for the employment of seasonal farm labor. Unfortunately, the railroad barons had a stranglehold on the export of California farm products to the east. The shipping rates were exorbitant, and they insisted that each farmer contract for a minimum of at least one full railroad car, a condition that smaller farmers could never meet. In order to deal with this challenge, Lubin helped establish the California Fruit Exchange, which is now Suncrest Fruit. Lubin personally traveled to New York, and in one afternoon, using a combination of moral imperatives and common business sense, persuaded the barons to drastically lower their shipping rates and remove the difficult demands they placed on farmers. With a single stroke, Lubin revolutionized and shifted Northern California's economy from mining to agriculture. Not bad for a kid from the shtetl. In the department store, Lubin kept his role in labor relations and established, among other things, an incredible employee benefits program with profit sharing, full and free educational facilities at night after normal store hours, and a free chaperone service to bring all the female staff home safely through the unsafe streets at night. When he heard that one of his workers had told another that one day he wanted to join the clergy, Lubin went ahead and arranged for him to enter the seminary and paid his way until graduation. David set up excellent housing, daycare, and schooling facilities for his migrant farm workers. His competitors said that he was foolish, that he was crazy, but he said that he had the most loyal and reliable workforce in California. Lubin became one of Sacramento's elites and married Louise Lorraine Lyons. She began collecting art and became president of the Sacramento Art Society. He encouraged the widow of Judge Crocker to bequeath her mansion to the city in order to establish the famous Crocker Art Museum. Lubin donated his own collection to the museum and presided over its inauguration. Alas, into every life some rain must fall. On May 10, 1896, the main story of the San Francisco Chronicle read, "A big Sacramento divorce sensation." Lubin had just divorced his wife after learning that his close friend, Bernard Steinman, the Jewish ex-mayor of Sacramento, had, over the course of several years, seduced her. Lubin ended up with the custody of the kids, and Louise Lyons disappeared from the story. She moved to Denver and never remarried. Too shaken and embarrassed to face his friends in Sacramento society, Lubin decided to take the children to see the world. He hired the supervisor of the Weinstock Lubin Night School, Mrs. E.M. Seymour, to serve as their tutor and governess, and sailed for Europe. Needed rest. If you look carefully, you can see their names all written down on the ship's manifest. This voyage concludes Lubin's early years, a journey of incredible accomplishments, a journey from rags to righteous. Lubin believed farmers around the world were being defrauded by the international traders who controlled the supply and demand of agricultural goods. He felt that an international institute to supply the latest trade and distribution information would be a great benefit to farmers. He tried to find support in Washington, but the bureaucracy turned him away. Despite his successes, to them, he was nothing more than a troublesome upstart. He decided to go abroad to visit the various heads of state in Europe. And finally, King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy agreed that Lubin's idea for an International Institute of Agriculture, or IIA, was a good idea and promised to support it politically and financially. The IIA concept was soon presented to a group of independent country representatives who agreed with the idea and decided to meet formally and discuss the structure of the new organization. The International Institute of Agriculture was formally established and opened in 1906. In a beautiful building King Victor Emmanuel insisted be called Villa Lubin. It was the world's first large intergovernmental organization. Never before had anyone seen an organization jointly maintained by several governments. Starting with 40-member governments, the IIA quickly rose to 60 members within a few years. They deliberated over all aspects of agriculture, yields, shipping, duties, and preventing the spread of animal and plant diseases. Lubin believed that if governments could so frankly discuss agriculture, they could do the same when discussing peace, and in 1910 proposed the original League of Nations. In 1910, he contacted William Stead, the famous English pioneer of investigative journalism. Lubin wrote that the IIA could serve as a template for an organization devoted to discussing world peace. Lubin called his projected organization the Confederation of Democratic States. Stead was enthusiastic with the idea and was preparing to widely promote it in the press. However, in one of those sad twists of fate, he was one of the more than 1,500 that perished in the Titanic. When Lubin created the Confederation concept in 1910, the rest of the world ignored the idea because there was peace at the time. Few recognized the approaching storm clouds of war. Towards the end of the ravaging war, Woodrow Wilson adopted Lubin's Confederation concept and began to articulate in detail what was to become the formal League of Nations. He ultimately won the Nobel Prize for the idea, but never gave any credit at all to Lubin. Lubin contracted the devastating Spanish flu on December 28, 1918, and passed away 3 days later. At the request of Italy's King Victor Emmanuel, Lubin laid in state in his coffin for a day and was then buried in the Jewish section of Rome's Verano Cemetery on January 3, 1919. Although hundreds of foreign dignitaries attended his funeral, not a single American did, even though dozens were in Rome to accompany the visit of President Wilson, who had come to promote the League of Nations. Washington's mores seldom change. Again, not a single American attended David Lubin's funeral. In his 1926 book, The World of William Clissold, H.G. Wells, arguably the most renowned social commentator in the English world, stated, "If ever the history of this great revolution in human affairs that may now be in progress should come to be written, there must be at least a vignette of that prophetic American Jew, David Lubin. He was a precursor, a figure rather like Roger Bacon." I should add here that the 13th century Bacon is considered by many to be the father of modern science. Wells went on to say, "I rather guess that his last years were overshadowed by the fact that there was hardly any recognition that it was he who had invented the original League of Nations. But the reality he had begotten, as he expounded it to me, was something much more modern, practicable, and far-reaching than any League of Nations." Now that thought should be borne in mind when we think of the current United Nations. I personally have no doubt that Lubin's version of the United Nations would be far more successful than the current one. Well, that brings this presentation to a close. I will leave you all with the question, was it nature, the challenging environment of a flourishing new country, or was it nurture? The small scar on his cheek and the fate foretold by the visiting rabbi right after his birth, a story that his mother always reminded him of, and the origin of his own name. Did that result in his brilliant life? Thank you.